Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because time matters on this road. If you like your stories strange, dark, and mysterious, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're headed to a flat slice of America where the sky feels too big and the land doesn't give you much to hold on to western Ohio into eastern Indiana. Cornfields, drainage ditches, a turnpike that runs so straight it feels like a decision you made hours ago and can't take back. Out here, there's an exit people talk about in the way you talk about a bad dream, trying to be casual, failing. By daylight, it isn't there. No ramp, no sign, no merge lane. But after midnight, when the temperature drops and the road hum settles into your bones, a green rectangle appears in your high beams. Exit 41B, white letters. Arrow right. The locals call it Lost Prairie. The map doesn't. Our story follows a woman named Jordan Pike, 30, night shift nurse. Strong stomach, steady hands, the kind of person who can talk a stranger through a panic attack with just a voice and a cup of water. She was coming home from a double at the county hospital, eyes sandy, scrubs smelling like disinfectant and old coffee. It was 2:06 a.m., an hour she knew well. The turnpike was empty except for the occasional semi whispering past like a thought you weren't ready to have. A patch of fog slid across the asphalt. Then another. Jordan turned off the podcast she wasn't hearing anyway. The radio clicked, scanned, found nothing but a weather station murmuring about a temperature inversion and localized ground haze. She cracked her window. Cold air pushed in, heavy with cut hay and something sweeter, like fruit that's 2 days past ripe. The first sign appeared so gradually it felt like it had been there the whole time. Exit 41B, Lost Prairie, 1 mile. Jordan frowned. She knew this stretch. She knew every diner, every billboard for fireworks and fireworks attorneys. She did not know Lost Prairie. It was all fields out there, a fence line, a row of windbreak trees leaning the same way year after year. Half a mile later, another sign. White arrow. Services icons. Gas. Food. Lodging. You don't exist, she said to no one, half laughing at herself. She could have used the gas, though. Quarter tank. Enough. Probably. The next real exit was 12 miles east. She told herself she would pass it. She told herself she was tired, that brains invent things when they're low on glucose and lower on sleep. And then, the ramp appeared on the right shoulder, widening. Guardrail gleaming. That polite slope down into dark. Jordan signaled because that's who she is. She took the ramp. The turnpike fell away behind her with a long exhale. At the bottom, she met a stop sign that reflected too hard. The letters were too clean, like no bug had ever decided to die there. Ahead, a 2-lane cut east-west. To the right, a gas station glowed white and silent. A small motel squatted beside it. Single story, doors painted that particular tan only motels believe is comforting. A diner with a chrome smile was set back from the road, open, flickering in red, as if someone was pinching the wire. Jordan turned toward the light. The gas station looked like a stage set. Pumps wrapped in plastic that wasn't torn, just loose. The credit card screen on pump 3 displayed a blinking cursor that never advanced. The clerk's area was stocked and empty, the sort of empty that says, "I'll be right back," and then never is. Jordan walked to the door and tried it. Locked. She cupped one hand to the glass and looked in. A handwritten sign leaned against the register, the paper browned at the edges. "Back in 10. Sure," she said softly. She checked her phone. 1 bar, then none. The clock ticked from 2:12 to 2:12. She could have left. Should have. The tank would make 12 miles. The turnpike was a left and a right away. Simple as heartbeat. But the diner's neon winked at her again, and she realized her hands were shaking. Food would fix that. Coffee would fix the rest. The diner door opened on the first push, little bell clearing its throat. Inside, everything wore a thin frosting of time, sugar shakers filmed over, a pie case holding 3 perfect slices that looked printed, The air smelled like warm toast and old pennies. A man stood behind the counter in a white shirt with a name tag that said LYLE in clean block letters. He wasn't young or old. He was the age of a thought you've had too many times. "Kitchen's still hot," he said, like they'd been talking. "Sit wherever." Jordan picked the end of the counter. It felt good to sit. The stool sighed. Lyle poured coffee without asking. The cup steamed like it was trying to say something. "Rough night?" he asked. "Long," she said. "I'm sorry. What town is this?" "I know the turnpike pretty well." "Gottly." Lyle smiled a little, like he'd been waiting for the question all night. "Lost Prairie," he said. "You're safe here." That last part didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like permission. A woman in a corner booth looked up then, hair tied in a scarf, hands around her mug like she was holding a sleeping bird. She had the expression of someone listening to a song only she could hear. Behind her, the motel sign blinked in the window's reflection, and in the blink, its letters rearranged themselves into nothing, just red worms on glass. "What's good?" Jordan asked, because asking normal questions makes reality behave. "It usually does." "Grilled cheese," Lyle said. "Tomato soup. Or pie. It's all warm." "Soup," she said. "And do you have quarters?" The motel sign said laundry. "And I need..." She trailed off. She didn't need laundry. She just wanted to ask for the coin. The impulse came the way you sometimes want to pat a dog you don't know. Lyle slid 2 quarters across the counter. They were colder than the coffee mug. "We trade square here," he said. "You can settle up before you go." Jordan picked up 1 quarter. On the obverse, Washington wore a nick across his jaw like a pale scar. She didn't recognize the state on the reverse. The outline looked like a mistake. "Where's everybody?" she asked. "Seems quiet." "Depends when you ask," Lyle said. "You coming off the pike?" "Yeah." Lyle nodded like that meant something. "Road's been hungry," he said. "Fog pulls people sideways. You found the right place to step out of it." The soup came the right red, steam curling, a skin forming and breaking like a memory. Jordan ate. The heat steadied her. Lyle didn't hover. The woman in the booth hummed without opening her mouth. At some point, Jordan realized the coffee didn't cool. It stayed at that first sip temperature no matter how long she let the conversation and the spoon trick the clock. She checked her phone again. 2:12. Again. 2:12. "Can I ask you something weird?" she said. Lyle tipped his head. "How do I get back on the turnpike?" The question sounded too heavy. She felt suddenly stupid for asking it. Like asking a lake how to be less wet. "Same way you came," Lyle said. "Left at the light, up the ramp. But don't look at the sign. Let it look at you. And when you merge, don't check your mirrors right away. The road doesn't like to be watched." "Leaving. That's weird," he finished for her. "Yeah." Jordan paid. The quarters clinked against the counter and sounded like they'd dropped too far. She stood. The bell at the door cleared its throat again as she left. Outside, the fog had thickened. Shapes moved in it, not bodies. Exactly. Suggestions. The motel's doors were all closed. In the office window, a TV blued the blinds with a show that had no sound and no cuts. She got in her car. The engine turned like it had been sleeping lighter than she had. At the intersection, the light was red. No cross traffic, no wind, just red, and the fog moving like breath on glass. Jordan waited. The red was not going to turn. When it felt like a dare, she looked down at her lap and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. When she looked up, the light was green. The ramp rose like a dark throat. The turnpike flowed above, white lines pulsing, semis moving like planets that forgot you. She merged, eyes forward, hands soft on the wheel. For a second, only a second, she almost checked her mirror. That's the moment the urge is strongest, when the danger feels like it's already gone. She kept her eyes ahead. She breathed out. The coffee in her chest finally cooled. 10 miles later, she let herself glance to the right, where the shoulder meets the weeds. No ramp. No sign. A gap in the fence line that might have been anything. The fog thinned. The temperature lifted a degree. The radio found a song she used to love and hadn't heard in years. Her phone woke up and scolded her with notifications. She laughed then, out of nothing but relief. It came out like a hiccup and made her eyes water. At home, she slept like she'd been dropped. When she woke at noon, the quarters were on her kitchen counter where she didn't remember putting them. She picked one up. It wasn't cold anymore. It was room temperature, coin temperature, forgettable. But when she flipped it over, the state outline had decided what it was. Ohio, of course. And yet there, in the outer ring of text, between United and States, a hairline crack that formed a tiny, narrow sliver. Like a ramp you only see if you stop trying to. Jordan went back over the next few weeks. In daylight, exit 41B was just nothing. Corn, a fence, the suggestion of a dip where rainwater collected if the wind was right. At night, she avoided that stretch, without deciding to. When coworkers asked why she took the long way home, she said construction, or deer, or boredom. You don't talk about a place like that unless you know the person hearing you won't try to go see it for themselves. People will tell you America is all mapped, that there are no blank spaces left, only smaller and smaller unknowns squeezed into the drainage ditches of the interstate. That's true, mostly. But some exits aren't for everyone. They're for the ones the road would like to keep, just for a minute, until the fog decides it's bored of you. If you find yourself out there after midnight, if the green rectangle blooms ahead, where there isn't supposed to be anything, if your dashboard clock decides this minute is worth repeating, here's how you pass through. Take the ramp like you meant to. Warm your hands around a coffee that refuses to cool. Pay for something simple with something small. When you go, don't look back too soon. Let the road do the leaving. And later, when you empty your pockets and a coin feels colder than it should, don't throw it out. Some places don't want your fear. They want your manners. And if you ever hear somebody at a truck stop ask where Lost Prairie is, just shake your head and say you haven't seen it in years. Then finish your coffee and go while the light is green.
At 2:33 a.m., the knock came from inside the walls. The old Victorian house on Elm Street was a beautiful wreck. It had peeling paint, sagging porches, and a widow's walk that looked out over the entire town of Portland, Oregon. For Leo, a history professor and a restorer of antique furniture, it was a dream. He saw past the decay and imagined the stories the house could tell. He spent his life working on things that were old and broken, and this house felt like his greatest project yet. He bought it at a steal, and for the first few months, the creaks and groans of the old place were just the sounds of history settling in. The first strange event happened 3 weeks after he moved in. He was in his study, a room with a large bay window and walls lined with books, when he heard a sound. A quiet, rhythmic tapping. He thought it was a branch from the ancient oak tree outside, scratching against the window pane. He went to the window, opened it, and looked. The tree was still. The tapping stopped. He shrugged it off as a house noise and went back to his desk. The next night, it was louder. He was in the kitchen making tea when the tapping began again. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the stove. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster. The sound was faint, but clear. It was a single, gentle knock. Knock. Then, a pause. Knock. He pulled back, a cold shiver running down his spine. It was a human sound, not a settling beam or a scurrying animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. He told himself it was a neighbor, a prank, or maybe a pipe. But the knocking was too precise, too isolated to be a plumbing issue. He walked around the kitchen, tapping on different spots on the wall, trying to find the source. The knocking didn't respond. It simply stopped. The pattern became terrifyingly predictable. Every night, at precisely 2:33 a.m., the knocking would start. Sometimes it was faint, a gentle whisper from within the walls. Other times it was so loud it sounded like someone was trying to break through. It was always a single knock, followed by a pause, and then another single knock. It was a quiet, relentless, unsettling rhythm. He started keeping a journal. He would write down the time the knocking started, the duration, and its intensity. He'd write about the feeling it gave him, a deep, visceral dread. He began to anticipate it, his body tensing as the clock ticked past 2:30 a.m. He'd sit up in bed, his heart pounding, his eyes fixed on the walls, waiting for the sound that would tell him he was not alone. He tried to reason with himself. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in facts and logic. He brought in a contractor, an old man named Bill, who had worked on houses in the area for decades. Bill went from room to room, tapping on the walls, checking for loose plaster or water damage. He found nothing. "Old houses just make noises, son," he'd said with a shrug. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It was a look of weary recognition, a look that said he had seen things he couldn't explain. Leo couldn't escape it. The knocking became his personal clock. He'd fall into a deep sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sudden, sharp rap from within the walls. He started spending his nights in the living room, in a chair in the middle of the floor, far away from any walls. But even there, he could hear it. The sound would travel through the floorboards, through the air, finding him no matter where he was. It was a sound meant for him. He began researching the house's history. He went to the city archives, poring over old blueprints and property records. He found a strange note in the original deeds, a clause that mentioned a sealed-off room, a small 5-by-5-foot space between the pantry and the laundry room. It had been sealed up for reasons unknown, and the original owner had insisted it never be opened. The pantry and the laundry room. Leo's heart pounded in his chest. The knocking came from the wall that separated those two rooms. He felt a profound sense of dread. There was something in there, something that wanted out. He went to the laundry room, his flashlight in hand. He shined the light on the wall where the knocking was loudest. The wall was a seamless expanse of plaster. There were no cracks, no lines to indicate a hidden door, but as he ran his hand over the surface, he felt a faint, cold spot. A patch of wall that was colder than the rest. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing. The knocking would only come at 2:33 a.m. He waited for the clock to strike the appointed hour. He sat in the laundry room, his back against the opposite wall, his eyes fixed on the cold spot. He felt a deep sense of wrongness, of a hidden history screaming to be heard. The clock ticked closer. He held his breath. 2:32 a.m. The air grew heavy. The silence in the house was absolute. Even the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen faded into nothingness. 2:33 a.m. He heard it, a single, sharp knock. It came from the cold spot on the wall. It was not a gentle tap this time. It was a desperate, pleading sound, a voice without a mouth, trying to get his attention. Knock. Another one. Louder. Knock. He couldn't take it anymore. The mystery, the fear, the relentless rhythm had broken him. He went to his shed, grabbed a hammer, and returned to the laundry room. He didn't care about the history, the property value, or the original deeds. He just needed to know. He needed to make it stop. He took a deep breath, raised the hammer, and swung. The hammer hit the plaster with a dull thud. A small crack appeared. He swung again and again, the plaster shattering, revealing the lath and plaster beneath. He kept hitting, tearing the wall apart, until he hit a piece of wood. It was an old piece of wood, but it was solid. He hammered away at it, his arms aching, his mind a feverish blur of fear and determination. He kept going, until he had torn a hole big enough to see inside. He shined his flashlight into the darkness. The space was a small, dusty closet. There was a single small chair in the middle of the room. On the seat of the chair, sitting perfectly still, was a doll. It was a little boy doll, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with porcelain skin and painted blue eyes. The doll was sitting in a pose that was eerily human, and on the floor next to the chair, there was a single small piece of paper. He reached in, his hand shaking, and pulled it out. It was a note, written in a child's shaky hand. It said, "I want to play." And mescrew, Leo dropped the paper and the flashlight. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking stopped. The silence returned. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a predator who had found its prey. He had opened the door. He had let it out. He sold the house a month later. He didn't tell the new buyers about the hole in the wall, the sealed-off room, or the doll he had found. He couldn't. Who would believe him? He moved to a new city, to a modern apartment, with no history, no secrets, no hidden rooms. He got a new job, a new life. He was a man who had left his ghosts behind. But some things can't be left behind. Sometimes, at night, when the city is quiet and the moon shines through his window, he wakes up. His heart pounds, a cold chill running through his veins. He looks at the clock on his phone. 2:33 a.m. He looks at the wall of his new, modern, perfectly sealed apartment, and he waits, and he listens. And sometimes, just sometimes, he hears a single, gentle knock. A knock that he knows is not a pipe, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It is a knock that has followed him across a country, a knock that has found him in the quiet of the night, a knock that has come from inside the walls. And he knows with a terrifying certainty that he is not alone, and that he will never be. The quiet, relentless terror of the knocking continued to haunt him even in his new life. It was a mental tic, a phantom limb of fear that would never go away. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, convinced he could hear it from the very core of his modern apartment building. His new life was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy. He would go to work, talk to his colleagues, and eat dinner with new friends, but underneath it all, a part of him was always listening. He would find himself staring at blank walls, wondering if he could see the faintest of shadows moving behind the paint. He tried to fight back. He went to a therapist, a kind woman who listened to his story with a compassionate but skeptical ear. She suggested it was a manifestation of trauma, a psychological echo of the fear he had experienced. He went on medication, hoping to dull the edges of his anxiety. He tried meditation and mindfulness, anything to quiet the ceaseless, terrifying voice in his head. But the knocking was not in his head. It was a memory, a reality, a thing that had become a part of him. One night, he was out with friends. They were laughing, telling stories, and he felt a brief moment of freedom. He looked at his watch, 2:32 a.m. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the icy chill. He excused himself, went to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were wide, and his face was gaunt, the face of a man who had not known a moment of true peace in months. He returned to the table, but he couldn't stop looking at his phone. 2:33 a.m. He felt the vibration first, a faint tremor, as if someone had just tapped the glass of his phone. He looked down at the screen. There was a text message, a new number, a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. "You left me alone!" He dropped the phone, his hands shaking. His friends looked at him, their laughter dying on their lips. "Leo, what's wrong?" one of them asked. He didn't answer. He just stared at the phone on the table, the terrible words glowing in the dim light of the restaurant. The knocking wasn't just in the walls. It was in the air, in the technology that connected him to the world. It had found a new way to reach him. He ran from the restaurant, ran through the dark streets of the city, the cold night air biting at his skin. He ran back to his apartment, slammed the door shut, and stood in the middle of his living room, his back against a wall. The knocking wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from his phone, from the computer, from the television. It was in the very wiring of his modern life. It had spread. He spent the next few days in a state of terror. He didn't answer his phone. He turned off his computer. He unplugged every electronic device in his apartment. He was living in a self-imposed isolation, a desperate attempt to cut off the source of the terror. He ate cold food, and he read books by candlelight. He told himself it was just a prank, a sick joke by a friend who had found his journal. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wasn't. One night, the power went out. The entire city block was plunged into a sudden, absolute darkness. Leo sat in his living room, a single candle casting a dancing shadow on the walls. He felt a profound, unnerving silence. No hum of the refrigerator, no light from the street lamps, just him and the darkness. He felt a moment of hope, a desperate, flimsy belief that this was it, that the power outage had finally severed the connection. 2:33 a.m. He heard it. A single, sharp knock. It wasn't coming from his phone, or his computer, or the walls. It was coming from the window. He looked at the window, the faint outline of a child's hand visible against the glass. The hand was tapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm. The glass was not just tapping, it was a single, sharp knock, the knock that had followed him. It wasn't in the walls, it wasn't in the electronics, it was in the world. It was a reality. He was no longer a restorer of old things. He was a curator of a nightmare. He had opened the door, and the thing behind the walls had come out. It had followed him, and it would continue to follow him. He realized that the note in the closet, "I want to play," wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation, and he had accepted it, and now the game would never end. The doorbell that only rang at 3:15 a.m. The house on Sycamore Street, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, was a perfect blend of modern comfort and classic charm. Its white picket fence, a meticulously manicured lawn, and a sleek gray exterior were a welcome sight for Julia, a successful software engineer. She had just bought the house, a single story with a sunroom that overlooked the mountains, and it was everything she had worked for. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the house, with its smart locks and automated lighting, felt like an extension of her own organized life. The first few weeks were idyllic. She spent her evenings in the sunroom, watching the sunset, her days filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life well earned. The house was calm, a haven of peace, until the night the doorbell rang. It was 3:15 a.m. Julia was a light sleeper, and the sound of the chime, a classic ding-dong that echoed through the silent house, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Who would be at her door at this hour? She crept out of bed, her phone in her hand, and checked the security camera feed. Her porch was empty. No one. The motion sensor hadn't been triggered, and the camera log showed no activity. It was a phantom chime. She went to the front door, peered through the peephole, and saw only the dark, empty street. She went back to bed, her mind racing, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The next night, it happened again. 3:15 a.m. The same ding-dong. She sprang out of bed, checked the camera, and found nothing. This time, a cold dread replaced her initial surprise. This was not a fluke, it was a pattern. She started to dread the night, the clock ticking closer and closer to the appointed hour. She would sit up in bed, her eyes fixed on the digital display, waiting for the sound that was both impossible and terrifyingly real. She tried everything to stop it. She disabled the smart doorbell, unplugged the chime, and even went as far as to remove the button itself from the wall. The house was silent, dark, and empty. She went to bed, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She would finally get some rest. But at 3:15 a.m., the sound came again. It was faint this time, a ghostly echo of the chime, as if the sound itself had been imprinted on the house. It was not a physical sound. It was an auditory hallucination, a sound that was only for her. She began to spiral. The lack of sleep, combined with the psychological terror of the phantom chime, was taking its toll. Her work was suffering, her perfectly organized life was falling apart, and her friends started to notice her gaunt face and haunted eyes. She tried to tell them, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. My doorbell keeps ringing, but there's no one there. They suggested she was stressed, that she was imagining it, but she knew she wasn't. The fear was too real. She tried to fight back with logic. She bought a new, more advanced security system. She installed infrared cameras and motion sensors all around the perimeter of her house. She even set up a camera inside the house, pointing at the front door, hoping to catch some glimpse of the impossible. She went to bed that night, a single, determined thought in her mind. She would find an answer. At 3:15 a.m., the faint, ghostly ding-dong echoed through her room. She sprang out of bed, grabbed her tablet, and checked the security camera feed. The outside cameras were still, the street was empty, and the motion sensors showed no activity. She switched to the inside camera, and her blood ran cold. The camera showed her front door, perfectly still and unremarkable. But as she watched, she saw a faint indentation appear on the surface of the wood, a small, circular impression, as if an invisible finger were pressing the now absent doorbell button. It was a phantom touch, a contact that was only visible to the camera's eye. The indentation lingered for a moment and then faded. The phantom chime had been the sound of an invisible visitor, an impossible presence that was trying to get into her house. Julia's mind reeled. This was not a hallucination. This was real. She was being haunted. But why? What did it want? She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in on the circular indentation. It was a perfect circle, a small, silent ring of pressure on her door. It was a persistent, patient, and terrifying attempt to get her attention. She had lived in this house for weeks, and this thing had been there all along, waiting for the opportune moment, for the dead of night, to announce its presence. She couldn't stay. She put the house on the market, desperate to escape the phantom chime and the invisible visitor. She packed her belongings with a frantic energy, throwing things into boxes without care. She just needed to be out. She needed to be gone before the next night. The house sold quickly, and she moved into a high-rise apartment in the city, a place with a doorman and security cameras on every floor. She felt a profound sense of relief as she settled in. The city noise was a comforting blanket, a constant, predictable sound that kept the silence at bay. She slept soundly for a week, and then two. She started to believe she had escaped. But some things can't be escaped. Sometimes a haunting is not about a place, it's about a person. One night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a ringing sound in the distance. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. She heard a sound, a faint, impossible ding-dong. It was not coming from her doorbell. It was coming from inside her phone. A ghostly echo, a notification sound she had never heard before. She looked at her phone. There was a notification on her calendar. It said, "Time to open the door." Her mind went blank with terror. It had followed her. It had found her. It was not the house. It was her. The doorbell wasn't meant for the house. It was meant for her. It was a silent, persistent knock on her soul, a plea for her to let it in. She looked at the door of her apartment, a solid, modern, locked door. She imagined the circular indentation on the surface of the wood, the invisible finger pressing against it, patiently waiting for her to respond. She knew she couldn't run anymore. This wasn't a problem she could solve with technology or logic. This was something ancient, something that had found her for reasons she couldn't fathom. She had to face it. That night, she made a decision. She would open the door. She sat in a chair in her living room, her eyes fixed on the clock on her phone. She felt the coldness, the familiar dread. The clock ticked closer to 3:15 a.m. She took a deep breath. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the most logical thing to do was to face the impossible. 3:15 a.m. The sound came, the faint, ghostly ding-dong, a sound that was not in her ears but in her mind. She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked to her front door. She took a deep breath, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she unlocked the deadbolt. She turned the knob and slowly, deliberately, pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. The lights were on, the cameras were on, and there was no one there. She felt a profound sense of confusion. She had expected a gaunt figure, a shadow, a presence. But there was nothing. The doorbell didn't ring again. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty hallway. She closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. She had faced her fear, and it had vanished. She woke up the next morning, feeling a sense of peace and liberation she had never known. She thought about the phantom chime, about the ghost that had haunted her. It was over. She was free. But some things are not that simple. As she was getting ready for work, she noticed something strange on her left hand. On her ring finger, a small circular impression, a faint, ghostly bruise, as if an invisible ring had been pressed onto her skin. She tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't fade. It was a permanent mark, a silent souvenir of the night she had opened the door. She looked at her hand, and she felt a sudden, deep sense of understanding. It wasn't about a door. It was about a commitment. She had invited it in. She had accepted its presence. The doorbell was not a request to enter. It was a symbol of a promise. She had been chosen. And the phantom chime had been the sound of an unseen ceremony. She was now bound to the thing that had haunted her, a partner in a haunting she had no memory of. And sometimes, when she's alone and the city is quiet, she looks at her hand, at the faint circular bruise, and she hears it, a soft, gentle knock. A knock that is not a chime, but a promise. A knock that has followed her and will continue to follow her for the rest of her life. She is not just a homeowner anymore, she is a bride to a ghost. And the phantom chime was the sound of her wedding bells. Why his bedroom window was always unlocked in the morning. The apartment on the third floor of a pre-war brownstone in Brooklyn was a classic New York City find. High ceilings, hardwood floors that groaned with every step, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. For Ethan, a young architect, it was a dream. He had moved there for the space and the light, a welcome change from the cramped studio he had occupied for years. He meticulously arranged his furniture, set up his drafting table by the window, and settled into a life of predictable, quiet solitude. The first strange occurrence was so subtle he almost missed it. He was a creature of habit, and his morning ritual never varied. He would wake up, get a cup of coffee, and then go to his bedroom window to look at the street below. One morning, as he opened the blinds, he noticed his window was unlocked. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. He was a stickler for security, a habit ingrained from years of city living. He shook his head, thinking he must have been tired, and locked it again. It happened the next day, and the day after that. Every morning, without fail, the window would be unlocked. He started to take it more seriously. He would double-check the lock before getting into bed. He would even take a picture of it with his phone, the lock firmly in place, the brass bolt slid securely into the frame. In the morning, he would check the photo and then look at the window. The photo would show the window locked, the window would be unlocked. He couldn't explain it. He was a rational man, a man who believed in cause and effect. He considered every possibility. Was it a draft? A faulty lock? He took the lock apart, cleaned it, and reassembled it. It worked perfectly. He even installed a secondary lock, a simple latch at the top of the window frame. He would lock both of them, and in the morning, both would be unlocked. It was a maddening, impossible reality. The feeling of dread began to seep into his life. He was no longer just annoyed, he was terrified. Someone or something was in his room every night. He couldn't shake the image of a gaunt, shadowy figure standing by his bed watching him sleep. He had no proof, no other evidence of an intrusion. The apartment was pristine in the morning. Nothing moved, nothing missing, just the open window. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one that he placed on his dresser, pointing directly at the window. He was so nervous that night he barely slept, waking up at every creak of the floorboards. In the morning, he checked the camera. The video showed him getting into bed, the room falling silent. He fast-forwarded through the footage, watching himself sleeping peacefully. Then, at 2:47 a.m., he saw it. The camera's red light flickered on, the window was in the frame, and he saw, with a gut-wrenching certainty, the lock on the top latch slowly, silently slide out of place. A moment later, the main lock followed, the brass bolt retracting with an almost imperceptible click. The window itself did not move. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out and unlocked it. He watched, his heart pounding as the video continued. Nothing else happened. The room was still. The camera's light turned off and the video ended a few seconds later. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had proof. There was a presence in his room, an entity that was not human that was unlocking his window every night. But why? What did it want? He looked at the video again, searching for any other sign, any other clue, but there was nothing. The room was a tableau of perfect silence and stillness. Just a window, unlocking itself. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable to an invisible intruder, was too much to bear. He called his landlord, told him he was breaking his lease, and began packing his belongings. He didn't tell his friends or family why. He didn't want to sound crazy. How could he explain that he was leaving his dream apartment because a ghost was unlocking his window? He found a new place, a modern high-rise in a different part of the city. The windows were new, made of reinforced glass, and the locks were mechanical marvels. He felt a sense of relief as he settled in, a feeling of security that he hadn't known in weeks. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening, before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first week was peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible film of dust on his nightstand. He wiped it away, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was as if someone had run a single ghostly finger over the surface of the wood. Then, he found something in his bed. A small, black feather. It was impossibly thin, almost like a piece of ash, and it was nestled in his sheets, right by his pillow. He picked it up, his hand trembling. It didn't look like any feather he had ever seen. It was a cold, alien object. He was losing his mind. He was trying to find a rational explanation for irrational events. He was back in the same cycle of fear, the same cycle of disbelief. He went to the old apartment. The window was locked, just as he had left it. He looked up at his old room, at the large, beautiful window, a window that had become a source of profound terror. He wondered if his replacement had noticed the unlocked window in the morning. He decided to do more research. He went to the local historical society, a musty old building filled with the memories of the city. He looked through old records of his brownstone, tracing its history back to the 1800s. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper. A young boy, a child named Edward, had lived in the building in the late 1800s. The boy was an insomniac, a child who would stay up all night, sketching in his notebook, his mind filled with fantastic, impossible creatures. The boy had an obsession with the window. He would open it every night, regardless of the weather, and stare out into the darkness, claiming he was watching for something that was coming for him. The article ended abruptly, mentioning that the boy had died in his sleep, a sudden, unexplained illness. The last person to see him had said that he had insisted on his window being left unlocked, a plea that his parents had ignored. Leo felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. The boy's room. It was his old bedroom. The boy had been looking for something, a creature from his drawings, and he had believed that leaving the window unlocked was his only hope. He had died and the window was locked. But what if the thing he was waiting for had finally come for him? And what if, in death, he was still waiting, still trying to open the window to let it in? He went home, his mind a feverish blur of fear and understanding. He looked at his modern, secure windows. He had left the old apartment, but the memory, the terror, the presence had followed him. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair, watching the sunrise, a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. The next morning, he went to his bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the window. It was closed. He looked at the lock. It was locked. He felt a profound sense of relief. But then he saw it. A single, small, black feather on the windowsill. The same cold, impossible feather he had found in his bed. It wasn't just his old apartment that was haunted. He was. The entity, the thing Edward had been waiting for, had found him. It wasn't coming in through the window. It was already in. He called a locksmith, a friend of his who specialized in antique locks. He had a strange request. He wanted him to install an old, complicated, beautiful lock on his modern window. He wanted a lock that would be a challenge, a lock that would require skill and care to open. His friend, curious, asked him why. Leo just said he had a fascination with old mechanisms. The lock was installed. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a brass lock with a complex series of tumblers and bolts. It was a statement, a challenge to the invisible intruder. He went to bed that night, a single black feather on his bedside table, a silent promise. He wasn't going to run anymore. He woke up with a start. The clock on his nightstand read 2:47 a.m. He looked at the window. It was still locked. He looked at his nightstand. The feather was gone. He felt a deep, profound sense of terror. It was no longer a game of unlocking windows. It was a game of possession. The entity was in his home, in his life, and it was moving his things, taunting him. The terror was no longer a silent presence. It was an active force. He spent the next few months living in a constant state of fear. He would come home to find objects moved, his keys on a different hook, his books in a different order. He would find these small black feathers in the most impossible places, in his coffee mug, in his shoe, in his pocket. The entity was toying with him, making him question his sanity. He would find notes on his computer, notes he didn't write, notes that said, "I'm here." He couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront it. He was a rational man, but he was at the end of his rope. He would do the impossible. He would leave his window unlocked. He would invite it in. He would face it. That night, he went to his bedroom window, his hands shaking, and he unlocked the intricate brass lock. He did the same to the old-fashioned latch on the top. He left the window open, just a crack, a silent invitation. He got into bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't close his eyes. He waited. He waited for the cold, the shadow, the presence. He waited for the feather to appear. He waited for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. The sun began to rise, casting a pale glow into his room. He was exhausted, but he had no fear. He looked at his window. It was still unlocked. He looked at his nightstand. There were no feathers. He felt a profound sense of confusion. Had it all been a dream? Had he gone crazy? He got out of bed, a new question in his mind. Not why was his window unlocked, but why was it no longer unlocked? He walked over to the window, his mind racing. He looked out at the street below, at the people walking to work, at the world that was moving on without him. He looked at the window, and he saw a note. A small piece of paper, folded into a perfect square, was stuck to the glass. He opened the window and grabbed the note. It said, "It's too late. I'm already inside." He didn't run. He just stood there, the note in his hand, looking at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had lost his mind, a man who had invited a ghost into his home. He looked at his reflection, and he saw a single, small black feather in his hair. He looked at the note in his hand, and he felt a single, slow knock on the back of his head. A knock that he knew was not the wind, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It was the last goodbye. It was the last time he would ever feel alone. The stranger who sat at the edge of her bed and vanished. The old farmhouse, set deep in the rolling hills of rural Ohio, was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. A wraparound porch for drinking coffee at sunrise, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth on cold nights, and a sky so dark with no city lights that the stars looked like a spilled handful of diamonds. She had moved there to escape the relentless noise of her life, to find a stillness she hadn't known since childhood. For a year, the house was her sanctuary. Its creaks and groans were the comfortable sounds of a living, breathing structure. The silence was a blanket she could wrap herself in. Then, the quiet changed. It was subtle at first. A feeling of being watched when she was alone in the kitchen. A cold draft in the hallway, even with every window sealed tight. She brushed it off as an overactive imagination, a side effect of living so far from civilization. She told herself it was just the isolation settling in. But then, one night, she woke up with a start. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Sitting at the very edge of her bed, his back to her, was a figure. A man. His posture was slumped, his shoulders bowed, as if the weight of the world was resting on them. He was dressed in what looked like an old, dark suit, frayed at the cuffs, and he was completely still. Eleanor was frozen, a statue of pure terror. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her mind raced, grappling with the impossible reality. How did he get in? The doors were locked. The windows were secured. She didn't own a dog, so there was no alarm to be triggered. He was just there. She squeezed her eyes shut and then opened them again. He was still there. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where sound should be. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She watched the figure, her eyes trying to make out his features, but he was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. She could feel his presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He wasn't breathing, not in a way a living person would. There was no rise and fall of his shoulders, just a desolate, unmoving stillness. After what felt like an eternity, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one hand and rested it on the bed, just beside his leg. The fabric of the comforter didn't shift, but she felt a sudden, profound coldness radiating from the spot. It was like touching frozen steel. Then, just as slowly, he began to turn his head. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could see the profile of his face now. It was thin, gaunt, with an unnerving hollow where his eyes should have been. The other side of his face was lost in shadow. He was turning, slowly, agonizingly, to look at her. She felt an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that had nothing to do with a home invader and everything to do with something ancient and wrong. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was not a person. He was facing her now. She could not see his eyes in the gloom, but she felt them. 2 pinpricks of icy malice piercing through the darkness. A shiver of pure dread ran from the top of her head down to her toes. Then she saw his mouth, a long, thin line that curled up into a slow, deliberate, grotesque smile. The smile was not one of mirth or greeting. It was the smile of a predator, of a thing that had found its prey. And just as she felt the scream tear its way up her throat, the figure vanished. Not faded, not dissolved into mist, he simply ceased to be. One moment he was there, a solid form on the edge of her bed, and the next the space was empty. The cold spot on the comforter was gone. The heavy, oppressive feeling in the room lifted, replaced by the familiar, comforting quiet of her farmhouse. But the quiet was no longer a blanket. It was a shroud. She didn't sleep again that night, or the night after. The image of that gaunt face, that predatory smile, was seared into her mind. She tried to tell herself it was a waking dream, a hallucination brought on by stress, but the memory was too vivid, too real. She bought a new alarm system, installed motion-activated lights, and even got a large dog from the local shelter. She did everything she could to feel safe, but the feeling never returned. The man came back. Not every night, but randomly, sporadically. Sometimes a week would pass, and she would begin to think it was over. Then she'd wake up, a sudden, cold dread in her stomach, and see him again. Always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., always sitting at the edge of her bed, his back to her. He never spoke, never moved, except for that slow, terrifying turn. She stopped trying to scream. She just watched, paralyzed by fear, as he turned his head and gave her that awful, empty smile. She became a prisoner in her own home. She would stay up until 4:00 a.m. every night, drinking endless cups of coffee, trying to outlast the visitation. She would fall asleep in the armchair in the living room, with the lights on and the TV playing, but she would always wake up in her bed with a cold chill and the gnawing certainty that he had been there, that he had watched her, and then, at 3:17 a.m., had appeared to sit with her. She began to notice other things. Objects moved in her house, the books on her shelf would be out of order, a favorite teacup would be in the wrong cupboard. Her dog, a large and boisterous golden retriever, would often whimper and refuse to enter her bedroom after midnight. He would stand at the doorway, hackles raised, and growl at something Eleanor couldn't see. He saw him. She knew it. He saw the stranger. Desperate, she started researching the history of the house. She went to the local historical society, poring over brittle, yellowed documents. She found a story about the family who had built the house in the 1880s. The family, the Andersons, had a young son named Elias, who was an artist. He was known for his beautiful, unsettling portraits, particularly of a gaunt, shadowy figure he called the Watcher. He claimed the figure sat with him every night, watching him paint. The story ended abruptly. Elias was found dead in his bed, an expression of profound terror frozen on his face. The official cause of death was an unknown fever, but the town whispers suggested something else. Eleanor felt a cold dread, so complete it was a physical weight. The date of Elias's death? October 17th, 3:17. the time of her own terrifying visitations. Elias had seen the stranger too. He had painted him, given him a name, and then he had died. Was that what the stranger wanted? To be acknowledged? To be seen? The thought was terrifying. It wasn't a haunting, it was a possession. A slow, patient claiming of a soul. She couldn't stay in the house. Not anymore. She put it up for sale, listed it with a local agent who didn't ask too many questions. She packed her things with a desperate, feverish speed. As she placed the last box in the back of her car, she felt a profound wave of sadness. She loved this house. It had been her sanctuary, and now it was a cage. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning Elias, leaving